Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I could ask that we please take our seats so that we can begin the afternoon plenary session and get into the last of our plenaries for the day. We're going to be looking at, amongst other things, leveraging a sustainable transition of finance to propel the green industrial transition, with a particular focus on transitioning through critical minerals in emerging markets and developing economies. We're going to have two panel discussions around that, or rather one panel discussion that spreads across a significant number of panelists, and we will get to that in a moment. Before we get to that, I would just like to welcome the dignitaries that have joined us, the delegates that have joined us, and we would like to make special mention of the Honourable Minister of the Department of Trade, Industry and Cooperation, Minister Park Stau. He joins us. He will be providing us with a keynote address on the financing of transitional activities. And Minister, if I could ask that you please take to the stage now to provide us with that. If I could ask that we give the Minister a round of applause.
Thank you very much to our program director. I imagine that protocol was observed many times. And if my imagination is correct, allow me to skip that part and say all protocol observed, except somebody said to me, you either observe protocol or you don't. There's no all protocol observed story. So I suppose we've introduced something that's called all protocol observed. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to stand before you today to discuss a subject that is urgent as it is transformative. That is leveraging sustainable transition finance to propel green industrialization through critical minerals in emerging markets and developing economies. As we navigate the complexities of our global economy, amid the escalating poly-crisis, we are called to reimagine the pathways to growth. Today, I want to spark discussion on how strategic investments in sustainable finance can unlock the potential of critical minerals, fostering a green industrial revolution that not only mitigates environmental degradation, but also propels inclusive long-term economic prosperity. We live in a time when the twin imperatives of economic development and environmental stewardship must coexist. Climate change, resource scarcity, and social inequality are converging challenges that require bold and innovative solutions. At the heart of this conundrum lies a simple truth. Our current fossil fuel-driven economic model is unsustainable, both for the planet and for future generations. Transitioning to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy is no longer a choice. It is an absolute necessity. Ladies and gentlemen, at the center of our discussion are the critical minerals, and this includes lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, and others that form the backbone of the modern new energy technologies and, in fact, ICT. These minerals are essential for the production of batteries for electric vehicles, the construction of wind turbines, the fabrication of solar panels, and many other applications that are fundamental to sustainable energy ecosystems. Emerging economies from South America to Africa to Asia are endowed with significant reserves of these critical minerals. However, simply possessing these resources is not enough. The key challenge is to extract, process, and add value to these minerals as close to source as possible in a way that is economically viable and environmentally responsible. The transition from raw resource extraction to green industrialization requires not only technological innovation, but also a substantial infusion of capital and capital that is aligned with sustainable, low-carbon development objectives. Ladies and gentlemen, the stark reality of South Africa's low economic growth of around 1% per annum makes for difficult reading. When one compares it with our peers like Brazil, whose growth has been around 3% for 2024, a continuing trend from 2023, we realize the need for an urgent capital injection into our economy. In the context of the just transition, sustainable transition finance is one such mechanism of injection. So, what exactly is sustainable transition finance? It is a broad term that encompasses the array of financial instruments and funding mechanisms specifically designed to support the shift from fossil fuel dependent systems to sustainable low carbon economies. This includes green bonds, sustainability linked loans, blended finance, and innovative public-private partnerships. Each of these instruments is tailored to reduce risks, lower financing costs, and align investments with environmental, social, and governance criteria. For emerging economies, sustainable transition finance is more than just a funding source. It is a strategic tool that can spur industrial innovation and create new economic opportunities. It is estimated by the African Climate Foundation that South Africa will need between 4 to 8 trillion rand for its transition. By attracting international investments into the critical mineral sector, South Africa can develop robust supply chains, boost local manufacturing capacities, and create jobs. Moreover, when these financial flows are coupled with sound policy reforms and strong regulatory frameworks, they can ensure that the growth trajectory is inclusive and environmentally sustainable. Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me. South Africa has been wholly committed to play its part in the transition towards a low-carbon global economy. This is expressed in the Climate Change Act of 2024, where we outline our goals and objectives for realizing South Africa's responsibilities at a pace which makes sense. While the promise of sustainable transition finance is enormous, emerging economies face significant challenges that could impede their progress. Inadequate infrastructure, regulatory uncertainties, limited access to technical expertise, and high upfront costs are common barriers that must be addressed. The solution lies in robust, forward-thinking policy frameworks and strategic international partnerships. What is also important is that the principle of common but differentiated responsibility in terms of access to climate finance becomes essential. Emerging economies need easier access to cheap finance and grant financing in order to meet our climate change goals. Governments in emerging economies must craft policies that not only attract sustainable investments, but also safeguard our local communities and the environment. This includes streamlining permitting processes, offering fiscal incentives for green projects, and enacting stringent environmental standards for mining and processing operations. Such policies create a stable, predictable environment that can significantly de-risk investments and attract global capital. Equally important are public-private partnerships and blended financing models. A more pertinent example is this is the partnership between the DBSA and government on the smart metering project, which has assisted in creating efficiency for municipalities and reducing waste and non-revenue losses. The collaborative arrangements combine public funds with private investments, spreading risks and pooling resources to finance large-scale green projects. Multilateral development banks and international financial institutions can play a pivotal role here by offering technical assistance, financial guarantees, and capacity building programs. Through such collaborative frameworks, EMDEs can bridge the financing gap, and accelerate the transition to a green industrial base. Ladies and gentlemen, in South Africa, we have a unique opportunity to leverage our mineral wealth to participate in the green transition. We have a competitive advantage in the battery assembly and manufacturing value chain, which utilizes some of the minerals beneath our soil. This opportunity allows for South Africa to reindustrialize off the back of these mineral deposits, as the demand for critical minerals is set to quadruple by 2024. This must be understood in the context of South Africa's mineral resources being underestimated due to limited exploration over the past decade. It must be emphasized that we will not be able to do this on our own. In order to get a place where South Africa is manufacturing full batteries and associated new energy components, we need regional integration with our SADC neighbors who possess the other minerals required for this production. This regional integration will come at a significant cost, and our development finance institutions like the DBSA, the IDC, and others will play a significant role in enabling the integration across borders. The DFIs will also be very important in stabilizing the local government environments that will attract the requisite investments to make this ambition possible. There are already inspiring examples from around the world where sustainable transition finance is catalyzing green industrialization in resource-rich emerging economies. In parts of Latin America, for instance, countries are capitalizing on their lithium reserves to develop domestic electric vehicle battery manufacturing capabilities. By leveraging green bonds and attracting foreign investments, these nations are not only reducing their carbon footprints, but also creating a dynamic, value-added industry that offers substantial employment opportunities. Ladies and gentlemen, let us seize this moment. Let us harness the power of sustainable transition finance to unlock the vast potential of critical minerals. In doing so, we can propel emerging markets and developing economies towards a future where industrial growth and environmental sustainability are not mutually exclusive, but are in fact mutually reinforcing. Together, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to create a legacy of sustainable prosperity that will benefit generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. If I could just ask that you remain on stage. Thank you very much, Minister, for that keynote. I've just asked the Minister to remain on stage because we're going to adjust things ever so slightly. We are going to, in the interest of time, double up on a couple of things. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce the panelists that we will be having in the discussion to follow this alongside the moderator for the two panels. And I would like to ask that all the panelists please join me on stage as I introduce them. We would like to do a bit of a small photo opportunity with the Minister while we have him before he disappears. So if I could just please ask that, starting with, of course, the moderator for our sessions this afternoon, that is the Chief Research Officer for Climate, or Chief Research Officer rather, at the Nelson Mandela School for Public Governance in Nimrod Zalk. If I could ask that Mr. Zalk please join us on stage. Kimberly Botwright, who is the Head of Sustainable Trade at the World Economic Forum. Celine Kaufman, who is the Chief Programs Officer for Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. Vera Shongwe, the Chair for Liquidity and Sustainability Facility and Non-Resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute. Mpho Mokwele, who is the Group Executive of Transacting at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Samaila Zubairu, who is the President and CEO of the Africa Finance Corporation. And last but certainly not least, Leslie Marsdorp, who is the CEO of the British International Investments. While our panelists make their way to the stage, I would just like to give you a bit of an understanding of how we're going to do the next panel discussion. We will split the panelists across two panels, so we will have a 45-minute session with the first panelist or first group of panelists. Then we will take a small 2-minute comfort break to switch to the next batch of panelists. The panel is a single conversation that will be a continuous conversation. We're just going to try and get as many perspectives in from the conversation as we can. If I could just ask everybody that we perhaps stand in front of the chairs and get a better opportunity for the photographers to take the photo. I did. Oh, I'm so sorry. I must apologize. I have forgotten one final panelist member, and that is the chair of Robank, Ms. Isabella Lesejinya. Thank you so much, ma'am, for reminding me that you're part of these discussions. Thank you very much. In the interests of not ensuring that we have any further delays, I would just like to ask that the panelists for the first panel remain on stage, and that Mr. Zalk also take his seat, and we get the first panel underway as soon as possible. The first panel will consist of Mr. Nimrod Zalk, as I mentioned, Mpho Mokwele on stage already, I see. There we go. Celine Kaufman on stage as well. And if we could have Vera Songwe join us on stage, as well as Mahoshi Lechete. If I could ask that you sit. You want me to talk? You have to sit in your seat.
Kudigi uskie fiti nadai kukupin maze uskie dhizi nadai nikuchiu nikubloka big Gina.
I will hand over the panel to Mr. Zalk in a second. Just a reminder, once the panel discussion has concluded, we will just do a switch over to the other panelists and continue the conversation. Thereafter, we will open up the floor to questions, comments, and conversations after that. Mr. Zalk, over to you.
Thank you very much to the Master of Ceremonies and ministers and others present. Welcome to this plenary session, which explores how transition finance can be leveraged to propel green industrialization in developing countries through critical minerals. I think some of you may have guessed I am not the eminent Sierra Leonean politician and former Director General of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, Dr. Kande Yumgela. My name is Nimrod Zalk. I'm the Chief Research Officer, Climate and Economic Development at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. Our school works with a focus on applied policy research, exploring how African countries can undertake climate-compatible industrialization. It supports the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat through an advisory council on trade and industrial development matters, and we have also, in conjunction with the African Climate Foundation, just launched a green industrial development expert panel intended to inform African policymakers about green industrialization opportunities on the continent. This research that has been undertaken by the school includes on battery and other critical mineral value chains. So it's often stated that Africa holds around 30% of the world's reserves of minerals required for the green and digital transitions. Demand for some, but not necessarily all of these minerals, is projected to grow rapidly. So to meet the lower end of our climate targets, conservative estimates are that by 2040, the supply of minerals like lithium will have to scale up by at least a factor of 13, cobalt by 6 times, and copper by at least 1.7 times. However, demand growth for some minerals is less certain. For instance, hydrogen-based technologies like fuel cells and green hydrogen have been somewhat slow out of the starting blocks, with much more modest demand growth for the platinum group metals that are required. Holding these mineral endowments represents a potential opportunity for African countries to add value, but it is clear that this will not happen automatically. As demonstrated by China, the decisive factor in directly adding value is developing the industrial capabilities and associated infrastructure to build critical mineral value chains. Building these capabilities requires a combination of industrial policies and financing at scale. African countries could also harness critical minerals more indirectly for green industrialization, for instance, by capturing a share of the resource rents through taxation and redirecting them to building climate-compatible value chains in other sectors, such as light and medium technology manufacturing and the modernization of agriculture. In either case, public development banks have an extremely important role to play. First, by scaling their balance sheets to provide finance for green industrialization. Second, by developing their technical capabilities to support project and sector development, thereby reducing risk and building a robust pipeline of investable projects. Third, development banks can use their privileged position as partners with private investors on the one hand, and their close relationship with governments on the other, to inform public policies needed to unlock green industrialization. These and other themes will be explored during this session. So, without any further delay, and very mindful of time, I would like to go straight into the questions for our panelists, starting with Vera Songwe, who is the chair and founder of the Liquidity and Sustainable Facility and a senior fellow at Brookings Institution. And the question for you, Vera, is developing integrated and sustainable critical mineral value chains faces hurdles such as infrastructure deficits, limited local processing capacity, and the need for upfront investments. What strategies can be used to build sustainable critical mineral value chains?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I want to thank Finance and Commons, of course, the government of South Africa, the minister who was with us for the introduction. In terms of strategies, I think 2 or 3 things maybe, and you already mentioned them. Of course, the first one is identifying, doing the mapping of what mineral resources one has, let me start by saying that we are now in an almost sort of half bonanza era, right? Where everybody is sort of chasing minerals and trying to see how much and where they are and what can be done with them. Africa is still behind, and I worry a little bit, even as we sort of read through all the minerals that Africa has. We're sitting now in South Africa. Many of you who are following, I'm sure, the price of, say, a mineral like platinum, right? We see the price going down. The reason the price is going down is because there's synthetic platinum that is being put out there. There's synthetic diamonds that are happening. And also very soon, as a continent, we will no longer be the place where you find a lot of these minerals. And so we have actually a very limited runway to be able to sort of exploit, what we have until somebody says, well, listen, I'm producing it in a factory in Antwerp. I don't need to come all the way to Cape Town to get it. And I think that period is not very far into the future. And that is why something that you mentioned, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, is mission critical, in the sense that if we could pool our resources immediately together today, we will be able to, scale and fast track the development and the use of those resources. I think each and every one of us in this room today has an iPhone or its equivalent. 2,000 pieces of equipment get into that iPhone, a lot of them rare minerals, many of them sourced from the continent. No part of that production process happens on the continent. That is because individually, we have all been saying we want to sell directly to China. We have, as a continent, the capacity under the AFCFTA to say, you can at least manufacture 3 or 4 of those inputs on our continent, pulling our resources together. So the first thing that we really need is that kind of political determination. We're seeing it in Europe now, coming together and saying, Team Europe. We hear every time Team Europe. Where is the Team Africa around rare minerals and adding value? We cannot be doing it as Botswana, as South Africa, as Cameroon, or as Ghana. We need a Team Africa to come together and build a supply chain that is able to do what is needed. I give you a second example. The GDP of the DRC today is $88 billion. The market for battery precursors is $127 billion. 80% of battery precursors are cobalt. DRC exports cobalt for a value of $18 billion. It gets transformed 3 steps into the production process for $127 billion. That is how much we as a continent are leaving on the table. And so if, again, we wanted to say that we wanted to build the supply chains, and I see the AFC here and BII, and that there are institutions on the continent that are able to finance this, but it takes political leadership to say, let's build those zones. Zambia is doing it now, DRC is doing some, but we could do more, we could do better, and we could do faster, I think. And national development banks are particularly important in that space because what they bring is local content, local understanding. They can take that initial risk, because they understand AFC has been investing in DRC now for the past 10, 20, so they know the environment. And they can, what will take 10 years for a US business to unlock, they can do it maybe in 6 months. That is de-risking. De-risking is not only about bringing more capital, it's about shortening the construction period of those projects. And finally, I don't know who has been reading the FT, but if anybody read the FT this morning, the long article on what is happening to Ukraine's rare minerals, what is the sharing agreement between Ukraine and the United States, who is going to do what, is it 50%, is it 30%? One of the mistakes that we make on the continent is essentially that we are still trying to get royalties from our minerals. We should be getting production sharing agreements from day one. Because what ends up happening is that the businesses come in, they exploit for 15 years, and they say, oh, we are not making any profits, we're not making any profits. And in year 16, when they have to start paying taxes, they say, we're closing down, we can no longer do this. And if you read the FT article, the agreement is we start doing revenue sharing, Ukraine and the United States, and exploitation, and I think we can do that as well on the continent. So coming together again as Africa and getting standardized revenue mining agreements is so mission cycle, because there is a race to the bottom of the continent, where essentially I go to your neighbor and I say I'm getting 5%, give me 2, give me 3, and all of us are losing in that deal. And hopefully we can get more transparency into this contracts. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for the insights. I then turn to Mahoshi Lekete, recently appointed CEO of the Industrial Development Corporation. So, first of all, congratulations. And secondly, access to international capital, especially for developing nations, is constrained by high borrowing costs, restrictive lending terms, and inadequate climate finance for adaptation. What approaches can be adopted by public development banks to unlock critical minerals finance?
Thank you, Nimrod. Nimrod, I see some of our colleagues here from MDBs, so forgive me for being a bit controversial. When we started talking about providing African countries and countries in other regions that are middle to low income some form of space to transition from fossil fuels to more green energy production, and time and things like that, discussing the timelines. Instead of agreeing to what was feasible at the time, the big question became, what do we do with the gas that we have? The gas deposits that we have. And like, no, that doesn't qualify. Right? What do we do with the nuclear that we have? Oh, no. Oh, okay, we're not sure. Yes, it does. So why am I saying this is international capital markets are not the problem for raising funds, but you are assuming that most of these countries are able to raise funding easily from the markets, because market funding has no conditions. It doesn't have any conditions except that you have to register with the securities authorities and so forth. The funding that we require is the funding from MDBs, is the funding from our bilateral partners, and those are the ones that come with conditions that make it difficult for them to even think about transition financing in a manner that supports our ambitions, and by our, I mean mainly African countries. So the intersection between mining, chemicals, renewable energy becomes very important, because in these rooms it's most institutions where mining is not supported. It's not, you can, they don't fund mining and particularly exploration. So most MDBs and regional development banks don't. And yet, these minerals that we need in order to develop require, renewable energy. So this intersection, I don't know how we untangle it to say, how do we support these sectors going forward, if some of them we support, some of them we don't. So I'm just putting it out there to say, yes, transition finance is necessary, but can we have a discussion around opening up what other sectors we use it for, which are going to help us transition? And in the meantime, what do we do? Because if some of the sectors we support, some of them we don't, it leaves countries in a very difficult position. So I just want to put it out there. But I also think that timing is also important. For example, the time it takes to develop a mine versus the actual development process also means that what we require is project development financing. Now, most of the funding with venture capital finances is really not sufficient for what we're talking about. This requires large-scale financing that can only come through development financing to really have us do this, to reduce that time between development and production, and do it at scale. And third, I believe that cross-border value chain complexities also want us to think beyond financing, to look at de-risking mechanisms that are going to help us deal with, one, bring down the cost of financing, but more importantly, to make sure that we are able to de-risk these projects. So countries are going to have to come together, especially on the African continent, to identify what across the value chains we're going to do in order to support each other. So in short, what I'm saying is at this moment, I think capital markets are sufficiently available for countries to raise funding, but it's the type of funding that we require to take this sector to scale. That is what we must discuss as PDBs.
Which is important if we are to unlock critical minerals. So we've launched our initiative, which is called SMART, which stands for Securing Minerals for the Energy Transition, together with our partners. So it's the aspect around smart partnerships, which is important. So that initiative is all about unlocking the potential of critical minerals in the Southern African region. So it covers a number of African countries in the southern tip of Africa, the DRC, South Africa, etc. So under that initiative, what we'll be doing is we'll be bringing together key stakeholders that are involved in the space. Key stakeholders, role players, such as financiers, such as mining houses, associations, and government bodies. And the intention there is to derive policy and non-policy interventions that can be implemented. You know, the barriers and challenges that I spoke to, it's all about then trying to unlock those challenges. But most importantly, it's about implementing those solutions that we've derived. So it does not help coming up with solutions, but if you do not implement, it becomes a futile exercise. So we'll be implementing the solutions and then tracking the progress over time. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to turn now to Celine Kaufman, who is the Sustainable Development and International Relations Chief Programs Officer for IDRI. I'm not going to butcher the French language by trying to pronounce that name in French, so I'll just give the English translation, which is the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. So Celine, public-private partnerships, regional collaboration, and strategic investments can enhance the process of beneficiating critical minerals, creating new jobs, and fostering sustainable growth. How can we leverage critical minerals in the context of financing for development?
Yes, thank you very much, Nimrod, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to be here today. Just coming back to IDRI, for those of you who don't know IDRI, we are the biggest sustainable think tank, or biggest think tank working on sustainable issues based in Paris. And we work on issues across climate change, biodiversity, financing for development. And I hope that I can complement the previous speakers by focusing on exactly that, the strategic partnerships that there are others mentioned on the panel. But to go back to some of the context that you mentioned, Nimrod, at the beginning, which is very important, and the first point being, we expect the demand for critical raw minerals to continue, not only because of the green transition, and we can see that there is a dynamic in the green tech that is now, that has reached like a tipping point, and that the cost is lowering, and we can see that notably in China. So the demand, whatever the geopolitics, is likely to continue rising. But the green transition is not only the only source of that demand, because critical minerals are also very useful for the digital transition. So that's super important. The demand, is really expected to continue rising. But the second point that you also mentioned is that we see increased competition across the big blocks to actually source those critical raw minerals. Increased competition. So what does it mean for producing countries, like African countries? It means first that, and you mentioned it as well, that there's a big opportunity for the countries, sub-Saharan Africa, you mentioned, which is globally producing probably 30% of the critical raw materials. But it's not only African countries, also Bolivia, Chile, Indonesia. So it's more than Africa. It's an opportunity, but it's also a challenge, because we know by experience that critical minerals abundance does not necessarily lead to critical mineral industrialization. And so hence the question of what needs to change today, how can we change the traditional extractive model that has typically characterized critical mineral value chains, and how can we leverage the critical mineral wealth for sustainable development? And of course, given that we can see the partnerships, MOUs, and contracts between countries developing, there is here an opportunity to change the terms of those partnerships and to make them more focused on the creation of value in the producing countries and the creation of robust industrial ecosystems. But it means a number of things, and let me mention maybe 3 generic points before going into what it means for the respective partners, the producers and the importers in a way. The first generic point is that it's not likely that a transactional approach that we see developing now can establish the trust and the long-term relationships needed to support this kind of partnership. But at the same time, and this is the second point, it is also very difficult to imagine in today's context and geopolitics that the multilateral system can provide a short-term avenue for crafting a truly international cooperation on critical minerals. But of course, coalitions of the willing are probably the way forward. All the more that we are in a context where both the producers and the importers need to diversify their supply or their consumers to mitigate the risk that any of those are not reliable enough. So that argues for multilateral, plurilateral cooperation. But if we see the development of these partnerships, be they bilateral or plurilateral, developing fast, we also need to acknowledge that they need to be more transparent. Because as of today, and this is really clear through the research of the Africa Policy Research Institute, there's no transparency on these partnerships. And to be accountable to sustainable development, they need to be more transparent. So what does it mean on the part of the partners now, the producing countries and some of the importing countries, and I will focus on Europe for that. But on the part of the producers, it really underlines the importance of the ambition and the anticipation in the form of coherent long-term strategies. And when I say coherent, I mean that we see a lot of these critical mineral strategies developing across countries. They are monitored by the international energy agencies, and those strategies need to be aligned with the development strategies of the countries and with the transition pathways of these countries. It's not only having those that are coherent with the sustainable development strategies of the countries. And of course, the second condition is that these partnerships are not only about transformation of critical minerals locally, but they embed the critical mineral access within a broader discussion of what industrial clusters will be developed and how the critical mineral supply chains will contribute to that, including the technology transfers that are implied beyond the sole critical mineral transformation itself. And the third point for the producing countries, and you mentioned it, Vasongo, is the key importance of regional collaboration to this transformation. First, to enhance the bargaining power in the partnerships that we are discussing, but also to actually inform joint common industrialization strategies for those regions and common energy transition strategies for this region. And Europe is doing exactly the same, trying to find a common industrial strategy. So what does it mean on the part of Europe now, where I come from, so I'll focus on this one. First, it's important that, of course, Europe recognizes that its strategic autonomy in securing green energy and critical raw materials is deeply related and linked to its partners' prosperity and stability. Europe is a resource-scarce continent. It is highly dependent on other countries for the imports of the critical minerals. And you can see the importance of circular economy, so trying to be more autosufficient in these critical minerals, and of the strategic partnerships with third countries in the clean industrial deal that came out yesterday. And just to quote what is in that clean industrial deal of yesterday, it says the Commission will launch the first clean trade and investment partnerships to diversify supply chains and forge mutually beneficial deals. So that's the first precondition that needs to be implemented now. The second is to recognize that there are economic cases supporting the development of green value chains where the minerals are located. And we have research showing that this is the case, for example, for green iron in Africa, rather than importing hydrogen in the EU. And the last lesson for Europe, in a way, is we are in a quite unstable period, but it's also a period where the EU can differentiate its offer from other partners to make it more attractive to partner countries, including through ensuring that the partner countries can capture a fair share of the benefits from green industrialization. And of course, that needs to address the issue that we mentioned before, technology transfer, but also co-innovation, knowledge and innovation ecosystem, and ensuring that industrial initiatives are designed to benefit local economies and communities. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I really liked your emphasis on the need for Europe to step up and forge meaningful partnerships with developing countries more than ever before in the light of developments on the other side of the Atlantic. So let me then ask everybody to join me in a round of applause for our first round of panelists. Thank you so much. And I think the MC will introduce the second round.
Another round of applause, please, for our panelists. Thank you very much to our moderator as well. To keep the conversation moving, as we mentioned, we are going to do this in two parts. The second part of the panel is going to be coming up on stage shortly. If I can ask that Mr. Sabaila Zubairu, who is the President and CEO of the African Finance Corporation, join us on stage. Mr. Leslie Marstorp, the CEO of the British International Investments. Ms. Kimberly Botwright, who is the Head of Sustainable Trade at the World Economic Forum, as well as Ms. Isabella Lesedinya, who is the Chair of Robank, for the second panel discussion. A round of applause, please, for our panelists.
Thank you very much, and thanks again to the first round of panelists who I think have helped to somewhat catch up on time as we're running a little bit behind. I will urge this round of panelists to be a little bit shorter than we had originally allocated, but I think we're doing all right for time. So let me kick straight off to Samaila Zubairu, President and CEO of the African Finance Corporation, in asking how can African countries ensure that the mining of critical minerals leads to long-term economic benefits rather than short-term exploitation?
Thank you very much for that question. And I think that we got some of those perspectives from the earlier session. I'll try to center my response around maybe, I would say, a project or two, just to provide practical perspectives of how to get this done. I think the first thing is we have to decide, what is important for us as Africans. And when we talk about critical minerals, critical for who? And I think that what we should be looking at more is what do we need as Africans, for our development? What do we need for resilient economies? What do we need, for our own growth and development? What is sustainable for us? And I think that if we think about the needs for us to rapidly urbanize, the need for us to build the infrastructure that connects the continent, that allows for the continental free trade area to emerge, build the economies that will support the energy transition for ourselves as well and for the rest of the world, then we know that we should focus on what is important for us. Now, it turns out that what is important for us is also important for the rest of the world, because what we need, the world also needs. So I would like to start from there, and I think that one of the best ways to do it is to use data to de-risk, mining. So it's very important to know what we have and to know the extent of what we have and to have the data that allows us to spend less on exploration. While doing that, it's also important to ensure that we are looking at a medium, long-range plan at the same time. So I'll give you an example. Currently, we are working on a project, to build a greenfield rail line between Zambia and Wakano in Angola. It's about 800 kilometers. Invariably, it's something that is imminent, so it has to happen over the next 3-4 years. There's no way we can get that steel other than from India or China or Turkey. That's just fact. There's nowhere else we can get that steel, to do that project. But we have several more kilometers of rail lines to build. So what's the plan to source those steels, billets, for that construction over time? That's how we should be thinking about it. We should be thinking about, okay, what are we going to need over the next 25, 30 years? What's the plan that we have to put in place now to ensure that over time, from let's say year 5, year 6, year 7, we are getting those inputs directly from the continent and not still importing from outside the continent. The second point is, I think Vera mentioned that point, is what is our collective bargaining power as Africa? And how can we ensure that we can negotiate and we have enhanced bargaining power, for what we need? And I go back to the battery minerals value chain. We did a study, about 3 years now, together, with UNECA, AFDB, Badia, AfrExim, African Legal Support Facility, that showed, the leakage, from exporting cobalt, copper, lithium, graphite, versus producing battery precursors. So when you produce those battery precursors, at that time, we're told that the electric vehicle industry or market was about $7 trillion and was going to grow to $47 trillion. Now, it turns out that even within Africa, we need at least 2 million trucks, for us to move goods around for the AFCTA to come together. So that is already a critical block of demand that we have internally already. So how are we motivating the production of those in Africa? We're also told that we need 5 times more mining of all the minerals and metals. And if we look at the current mining process, it's quite carbon intensive. It's also, a candidate for decarbonization. It's also a candidate for significant electrification. So if we are going to have all of that mining take place, how about getting, the dump trucks to be more electric and not diesel trucks? And because we know we're going to need a lot of those here, how can we motivate the production of those dump trucks, electric dump trucks here on the continent? And I always remember this, they said during the gold rush, people made more money selling, shovels and pickaxes than the people that made money from gold. So that is something that we should also have in mind, that because we are going to need so much more mining to take place, the inputs for that mining, it's a critical, piece of the value chain that we should also focus on to ensure that we are capturing value. And then I give an example of what we have done. We're working on, I would say, 3 projects at the moment. We're trying to ensure that we can build manganese smelters, to stop export of raw manganese. We're trying to build, actually far advanced, in the manganese smelter project in Gabon. We're also far advanced on the copper smelter project in DRC. And all of this demonstrate the viability of decarbonization on the continent. It demonstrates the viability of moving up the value chain. And it also shows the economics, that can accrue to African economies if we do that. So just to kind of wrap up, I think we should focus on a clear plan. We should not be thinking about just today. We should be thinking about what are we going to need over the next 25, 30 years, and ensure that we have a program or a mechanism to increase our value capture over time. So if we can source the materials locally, we're going to reduce the amount that we're spending. It means that we'll have less debt incurred as we develop. The fact that we're going to have 1.5 billion people living in cities is a lot of demand for steel, aluminum, bauxite, copper, and all of this. So we should have a plan now on how to do that. We should also be thinking about how do we produce what we need for ourselves and for the African continent. So bauxite, for example, is produced in similar quantities in Guinea and in Australia. But of course, Australia gets far more benefit than Guinea does. Why? Because Guinea is just exporting raw bauxite. So there has to be a conversation around how to transform the bauxite to alumina and to aluminum eventually. And we've done a study that shows that it's possible, and we think that we should do that. We are happy to do that, but we'd like partners to join us to ensure that that is done. There are several, significant iron ore deposits of high grade on the continent that we should seek to transform so that we can build the rail lines that we need for the continent with our own iron ore source locally.
Thank you so much for that very rich input and very tangible examples of what might be possible on the continent. Let me then turn to Isabel Lesegina, Chair of Rawbank's Board of Directors. The DRC is one of the nations that produce very important critical minerals. It's not always easy to navigate that production on the ground. What are some of the practical lessons you would highlight coming out of the DRC's experience of successfully mining and processing critical minerals?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the organizer for inviting me. I have to say first that I'm very happy to see that we have this debate, especially in the development finance arena, because for a long time, Robank being the private sector, into mining, we felt quite alone in financing mining in Africa for different reasons. So when Samaila mentioned critical for whom, we see how critical it's getting because more people are coming to join us in trying to find a solution. And most of the panelists mentioned the same thing, is that the country that have the most natural resources are the ones that receive the less adequate type of capital. All markets are seen as only resource extraction sites and not really as potential strategic partners. And there is no industrialization plan from our side, but also no willingness from the other side. So we have to take matter into our hands to make that happen. When we look at DRC particularly, 70% of cobalt reserve are in DRC, major deposit of lithium and copper, second biggest producer of copper, and we still haven't started to scratch the surface of what's underneath the whole copper belt. So the potential is very huge. And I can understand that sometimes when more than 90% of your exports come from extractive part of mining and almost half of your revenue, that you don't really necessarily take the time to look at how to think about long term. But I think that's where us as financiers have to look ourselves in the mirror and try to find a way to play an active role into not make sure that a continent doesn't only stay as an extractive site, but also go up the value chain and build local processing capabilities. At Robank, we've been financing a lot of mining, and in 2023, because we are aware of these challenges and opportunity, we provided $1.2 billion in financing into local and international mining company, going from simple copper and cobalt producers, but to financing processing mining companies. Now, when you talk about the challenges, everybody is expecting me to talk about the same challenges, but I'll talk about others. I'll talk about one that is mentioned in kind of foreign ownership versus local participation. And because the mining sector is dominated by foreign-owned company. Obviously, there are joint venture with the government, but it's dominated by foreign-owned company. And sometimes that created tension with artisanal miners and the wider community ecosystem, wondering if the allocation of resources is done in an equitable way. So that created social tension within the country. And so what we see in terms of the mining company, of particular example, what they do well, is some mining company, the mining company that are the most inclusive into the ecosystem of the community are the one that have the best resilience. They actively engage with government at all level, not only at top level, but all level of the government chain. They actively engage with the community. They are proactive in local content initiatives. And when I talk about local content, I don't talk only about local job, because that's the obsession of local job. There is a need to create local wealth. There is a need to promote local SMEs. That's how you create stability, and not by just saying, I provided job or I provided lighting to 5 million people. It has to be sustainable. And so with some of our customers, they reach out to us to collaborate with them to finance their SME suppliers, but not only on working capital, but also to help them scale. So we started providing asset-based financing to buy fleet trucks, to buy mining equipment, so these SMEs can grow at the same pace as the mining they're serving. I think that's when you kind of play in building wealth within your ecosystem, it works way better in general. And the second one that's been mentioning is we talk about infrastructure deficit, especially on the energy side. DRC has a 2,300 megawatt of energy deficit. And if you want to produce, process, industrialize, you need much more. And one transaction we are very proud of, and African solution to African problem, we syndicated with AFC a $400 million loan with APSA and FBN to finance the phase 3 of the Kamoa-Kakula mining complex that enabled Kamoa to reach a production of 600,000 tons, but also to bring 178 megawatt of clean energy back to the grid. And that's how you finance the transaction, you make it sustainable, and you bring in people to make it happen. There are a lot of other transactions like that that are possible, but there is a need, a way for people in this room to come and help, because, as was mentioned earlier by IDRI, we need a coalition of the willing, public sector, private sector working together to find a solution. It's not easy. There are a lot of steps. But if we don't play a role into industrializing, going up the value chain, then extraction will always be the last stage of our countries, where it should be just a first step or an integration process. And it's a development imperative, but it's just a human imperative for all of us as bankers. That's what we do.
Thank you so much. Let me then move on to Leslie Marstorp, CEO, also relatively recently appointed, of British International Investment. So congratulations. Now comes the hard part, which is the question, which is DFIs are instrumental in financing long-term industrial projects that may not attract immediate private investment due to high risks and long payback periods. What is the role of DFIs such as BII in green industrialization?
Thank you very much for the question, Nimrod, and good to join all of you here this afternoon. Let me start off by saying that I believe British International Investment and DFIs in general, together with the multilateral development banks, have an absolutely central and vital role to play in the green industrialization process. The first reason for that is, as you know, you need to have long-term strategic lenses to develop a new industry. It is very difficult for individual entrepreneurs or for an individual company to start a venture unless there's an ecosystem around it. I'll give you a concrete example. British International Investment, or BII as we are known, invested in Mahindra, which is a automotive manufacturer in India. And we invested in the electric vehicle sort of production facility, but as part of evolving an entire ecosystem around the sort of green transformation process in India. I have to say, Nimrod, one of the real disadvantages we have as Africa is that we have so many countries. I mean, I was in India a few weeks ago, and just to see and touch the sort of dynamism of that economy that has really been driven over the last decade or so by very ambitious targets on the green sort of transition process. They have a target on renewable energy to reach 500 gigawatts of power by 2030. Electric mobility was a very new concept in India. There are now hundreds of manufacturers, not 50, not 80, hundreds of manufacturers. Naturally, we are encumbered in Africa by this constraint that we've got 54 borders. You know, it's very difficult to develop an industrial policy that cross borders, as you would know, Nimrod, having been in DTI for many years. So it's very important for DFIs to come in and play that role. We represent patient risk capital, so we can seed and then help scale new companies, new industries, and we have the long-term patient lenses to be able to do so. The second point that I'd like to make is that it's very important also for DFIs to work in collaboration with the public sector, because we cannot drive an industrial strategy unless it's underpinned by a coherent industrial policy framework that emanates from the governments. So the only successful sort of industrial policy processes that you'd find in the world are the ones that are enabled by very strong public policy. The final point that I wish to make is that Africa, in my view, is really at the crossroads. As you know, there's two major revolutions underway now. One is the green revolution, and then there's the digital revolution. These two offer significant opportunities for Africa to finally now have the opportunity to diversify our economies. Many of the countries, whether it's the DRC, most of the mining exporters, have these commodities that are exported without much value addition. And this has been what we've been saddled with now for decades. If we are able to develop sort of green industrial value chains around the extraction, we'll be able to diversify these economies and create new jobs, create green jobs, which India has been very successful in over the last number of years. Now, I'll just end up with one or two examples. In India, we created in 2017 a company from scratch called Ayana, which is a renewable energy platform. We created it, and today that company that's only 7 years old have generated 4.6 gigawatts of power. We have just sold that company, and the proceeds from that sale will be able to invest in new investments. The point I'd like to make from that is we look at a market, identify where's the market gap, identify where's the opportunity to have significant economic impact via job creation, stimulating of new industries. Once we then develop those, we can then on-sell that asset and then redeploy the capital in other areas. I believe that there is an opportunity now for African economies to diversify and we need to explore and invest more in innovation. And this is one of the things that we are doing alongside the British government, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which is the part of government that is responsible for development, have green sort of industrialization or green manufacturing initiatives in various countries on the continent. So we work in collaboration with the British government to try and support. We cannot come in with an industrial strategy for a particular country. We can only come in and support the domestically developed and domestically owned and led industrial strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Turning now to Kimberly Botwright, who's Head of Sustainable Trade at the World Economic Forum. Despite commitments at global fora, climate finance remains skewed towards mitigation in developed countries, with much more limited flows to adaptation projects, particularly in regions most vulnerable to climate impacts. How can we think about critical minerals funding differently, and is there any link to adaptation? Not a difficult question at all.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question and for the invitation to be here today. So let's start by answering that tough question with some statistics for context. Public adaptation finance to developing countries increased from 22 billion in 2021 to 28 billion in 2022. While that's a welcome increase, the gap between the funds provided and the needs stands at 200 to 400 billion per year. Quite significant. Meanwhile, to secure sufficient minerals for the energy transition, investments in the technology projects and the infrastructure, which was raised several times by panelists, will be around 300 to 400 billion per year for at least the next 5 years. Many of the panelists before me have talked about the scale of the minerals that we need, but I'll just add one more statistic because I find it quite mind-blowing. That for batteries alone, we need about 300 new mines over the next decade, which is equivalent to opening a new mine every 12 days. I hope you think about that in 2 weeks' time. Now, given the list of statistics that I've outlaid and the great way that you framed that question, what is the link? How can we maximize the synergies between these financing needs and interests, the interest being the minerals, but the financing needs also being the adaptation levels, in a way that leads to industrialization and climate resilience? So let's now look at what are some links between mining activities and climate adaptation. There's a few. Natural resource management, including changing water levels, affects mining activities, but also ecosystem impact. So we know that mining can alter landscapes and render them less resilient. Equally, climate impacts will affect transport, logistics, and energy infrastructure, all of which we've seen are necessary for mining. Temperature fluctuations will affect the amount of energy demand and put the strain that you have on your energy resources going into the mining activities. And then drought and extreme weather may affect communities and the workers around and inputting into mining processes. Now, an obvious answer in all of this is just to say, well, mining companies should simply invest in climate resilience. But I think we need to dig a little bit deeper than this, and I think this is where some of the synergies can come forward. I think there needs to be a bit of a careful reflection that different operations and future projects will have different types of climate risks. For example, some may be dealing more with potential water shortages, others may be having to shore up their port or transport infrastructure in a particular way. And then you could, if you then were to be precise, you can look at collaboration with local communities in your project scoping and in your climate resilient scoping to actually be able to smartly invest and look at co-benefits. maybe this is a different type of way of looking at value addition. Also to say that mining R&D funding is relatively limited. It's mainly done by the private sector, and that mostly to date focuses on efficiency. What if we work with DFIs to look at mining R&D and to require that some of that is also really going into climate resiliency in a way that generates those local co-benefits? Now, this is a good vision, but how do we actually get there? At the World Economic Forum, our partners, which includes companies from across the minerals value chain, have created the Securing Minerals for the Energy Transition SMET initiative that was mentioned earlier. That includes up to 40 organizations. To date, SMET has focused over the last couple of years on identifying the biggest risks to the mining industry, which includes adapting to climate change and how to mitigate those. Going forward, we're planning an acceleration of these activities, but to complement this important global work, we actually really want to bring it down to a regional level. As was mentioned by Fo earlier, the World Economic Forum is delighted to be partnering with DBSA, and on behalf of my colleague Marina, I'm pleased to announce this 6-month process where we'll be looking precisely at what it means to drive value addition from the minerals value chain for the Southern African region, and we absolutely must take climate adaptation into account. We're really looking forward to these conversations and hopefully to working with all of you over the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our second panel. Really, really interesting discussion. So many points that have been raised. Unfortunately, we don't have time for question and answer session from the floor. But thanks everybody for your attention, and please could I ask you once again to thank this second round of panelists as well as the first in bringing this session to a close.
Thank you very much to our moderator as well as to our esteemed panelists. We have come to the end of this plenary session. We will be breaking off into our smaller discussion groups to continue the conversations that we have been having throughout this afternoon. If you are departing at this point and if you are heading out, we wish you the safest trip. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you in the smaller discussions and continuing to engage with you as we wrap up the summit tomorrow. Thank you very much.